So Sean Gourley, he's been focused on building mission-critical AI for the US military and its allies. In his early life, he was a Rhodes Scholar. He pursued his PhD in computational physics at Oxford. His research focused on the mathematical patterns underlying modern warfare. He applied AI and data analysis to real-world conflict data. His research was published on the cover of Nature magazine and has informed briefings to the Pentagon, the United Nations, and more. And fun fact, at another point in his career, Sean worked at NASA Ames. He was focused on self-repairing nanocircuits. Also joining us here today and moderating today's session is Steve Blank. Steve has a very long resume, so I'll try to summarize the highlights. Include like being the architect of the Lean Startup Movement, co-founder of Stanford's Gordian Knot Center, Repeat, founder, creator of Hacking for Defense, co-host of this speaker series, and among many other things. So let's give a warm welcome to Sean and Steve.
How many of you want to do startups? Really? At Stanford? It's like, come on, really? That's it? All right, another hint. So you didn't start out in startups, did you?
No. It was interesting. So I graduated 2008, right?
From a small school.
From a small school, an old school in England. And at the time, I always think it's kind of interesting. You take like, where does everyone want to go, right? When you're a class of MBA students, you're a class of Rhodes Scholars. Like where everyone wants to go is kind of like a barometer of kind of what everyone wants to do. I think I was the only person in my Rhodes class that came out to Silicon Valley in 2008 to start companies.
Wow.
Which is kind of, everyone was like McKinsey, law school, go and, do all that sort of, classic stuff. But now when you go back, the most thing everyone wants to do is go and start startups, right? So it's kind of changed. But 2008, the Valley it was the first year of Y Combinator. I think Sam Altman was building his first company, and so it was a different time. Yeah.
So, but before that, as Ernestine mentioned, you had a little detour in Oxford, and not only the paper in Nature, but what was the paper about, and how'd you get the data, and where'd you get the data?
Yeah, so I got to Oxford and had originally signed up because I did my master's in nanotechnology, hence the connection to Ames. And I got to Oxford and kind of, I think, spent the first week in what was going to be my nanotech lab doing biomolecular motors, which I think is super interesting. But I was also like, if I spend 4 years at Oxford in a kind of a lab, I've probably done it wrong. So I was like, I want to go and look at what else is out there. And there was a bunch of research that was going on in the physics department under sort of, it didn't really have a title, but we now know it as complexity, which has actually just received a Nobel Prize for the first time with one of the colleagues that we were working with at the time. So it's a proper field now, but at the time it was like, how do you model kind of human systems with physics-based kind of techniques? And this really appealed. So we started with financial markets and epidemics, pandemic modeling. We looked at information flow, but ultimately settled on insurgency. And it was one of those ones that I think at Oxford, it was the sort of topic of conversation that everyone was having was like, what's going on with this insurgency in Iraq at the time? And it was an interesting time there. Hillary Clinton was there. There was a bunch of people that had just come back from serving US military that were just heading out. There was a whole bunch of, I think, conversations that were just going around. I was like, this seems like an interesting problem. So we just started to get data coming online at the time from these blogs, which is kind of crazy to think that blogs weren't a thing, but they sort of maybe aren't a thing anymore. And then there were text messages that were coming out from like people on the ground. And so I was like, well, if we could start getting that information, we could start processing this to figure out where the attacks were happening and how many people were being killed. And maybe there'd be some kind of patterns that existed inside of this data. Now, we knew from 1930s research by a guy named Richardson who'd found some data like way back in the time that there may be some patterns in war that may emerge. So it was like, all right, let's give that a go. And so we started doing that really basic kind of language processing, sort of circa 2005 to kind of start finding these kind of things, building databases from what's now known as open source intelligence. It turned out we were really good at actually doing that, and open source data collected what we believe to be the biggest kind of data set of violence in Iraq. And then from that, found a whole bunch of patterns in the timing, the size, the location of attacks that were common not just for Iraq, but all sorts of insurgencies around the world. And then we set about building simulations, which we called agent-based simulations, to try and replicate these kinds of patterns and these sort of toy models of insurgencies. And we were quite successful at doing that. The whole time, I think the physics department just sort of like looked at what we were doing, was kind of like, what are you doing, Sean? Like, this is weird. You're in the physics department. And then the papers we were submitting would submit, the first time we submitted to the journals, they were like, this belongs in a political science. This doesn't belong, in these kinds of journals. But eventually that stuff, and I think it was sort of forced, like I gave a TED talk in 2008, and it was the fifth TED talk that was ever published. And I think that sort of forced the hands of the editors. They were like, we need to kind of take a look at this. And so within 3 months of doing that talk, we'd got it submitted into Nature and accepted, and it actually ended up being on the cover of Nature. And the big breakthrough on that was not only were there patterns in insurgency, but that we could explain and model them using these simulations, and then use those simulations to then think about counterinsurgency tactics.
Why don't you explain Alpha and Alpha 2.5, which I found incredibly fascinating to the good.
Yeah,
I think it's relevant here.
So if you take an insurgency and it reaches steady state, the distribution of attack sizes follows a power law distribution.
That's a big idea right there.
Yeah, so even it's sort of almost kind of blindingly obvious at this point, but at the time, like you could think of all the distributions you could think of, like, for conflict frequency of attacks to kind of follow, and you could think of any distribution, but it doesn't. It follows a power law with an exponent of 2.5. And not just Iraq, but every single war around the world follows that distribution, which is kind of...
look at this paper. It's like, well,
yeah.
You would say it's intuitively obvious, but not really.
Well, no, it could be any exponent, but it could be any distribution. And then there's no reason that every war should look like this.
Right.
Like, why should every war look like the same?
Why is that?
Well, I think the idea is if you have a war where there's enough time to collect data, you've got a war that's by definition in steady state, right? Like if one side were to dominate the other side, it would be over and there wouldn't be enough data to collect. But if there's enough data to kind of do an analysis on, then the data will suggest that the sides are kind of relatively equally balanced. And if they're equally balanced, the steady state solution of the patterns results in an exponent of 2.5. Now, question is, why does that happen? And this is where we start building these models. And you say, well, you've got this kind of steady state of where you go and attack an insurgent group, and you don't get rid of all the members, but you cut off the head of the group, perhaps, metaphorically or literally, the case may be. And then you get a fragmentation process. The group fragments. And then they go and join other groups. The resources go and reallocate themselves. But they don't reallocate randomly. They reallocate to the next most promising group. It's kind of like if your startup were to go bust, you would go and join the next most promising startup. You wouldn't just randomly go elsewhere. And so if you get that cycle continuing of attacking groups, them fragmenting, and then them preferentially attaching to the most promising candidates, you actually start to get power law dynamics, because it's basically a preferential attachment problem. And the preferential attachment dynamic coupled with kind of fragmentation starts to give rise to these kinds of power distributions. What's interesting as well is you get also in the timing of attacks, so the frequency between attacks and also the geographic diffusion of attacks. They're probably harder to explain mathematically, but you can start to read some of that work. But it seems as though there's an organizational structure that insurgents find that allow them to take on conventional militaries very effectively. And if they don't find this structure, they just simply don't exist, because it's actually very hard to fight an insurgency.
So was the military interested in this?
It was probably one of the most interesting things. So I was visiting a friend, and we hadn't even published this work yet, but there was rumors that it had sort of coming out, and I was visiting a friend in Washington, D.C., and within I think 6 hours of getting there, I was in the Iraqi embassy talking to the Iraqi ambassador, who was an engineer who kind of got it. And then the next day, I was pulled into US Central Command's briefing in the Pentagon. And they're like, Sean, what do we do about, and I'm like, I'm 25 years old. Like, I'm just this, we haven't published this. So it was intense kind of like interest, because ultimately it was like, how is this insurgency working and what's going on? So we got thrust into that. I ultimately sort of, right, well, how can I help? What can I do? Ended up spending a good amount of time in Iraq with Barham Saleh, who was the deputy prime minister at the time, just living sort of counterinsurgency.
And was there some secret to counterinsurgency once you understood
Yeah,
this?
so the big takeaway is we could run simulations inside of the models, and what we were saying basically was a little counterintuitive. The big groups you leave alone, right? You leave them alone, and the reason you do that is because they start to ossify. A group that has no new members coming in starts to become a group with more formal structure. So leave them alone. Don't tackle the little groups because there's too many of them, too numerous. Just leave them alone. Where you want to focus is the mid-size, mid-strength groups, and you want to ensure that there's no pathway from a small group to a large group, because that basically not only stops the large groups from getting innovation, but it also means they have to act more and more like kind of government organizations. So the middle groups are easier to attack, they're less resourced, and you can stop that trajectory from small to large happening. I put it in Silicon Valley, it's more like if you're a large company, just acquire all the smaller competitors, bring them into your organization and make sure they don't do anything. And
You mean acqui-hires?
yeah, that's right. And so that sort of strategy.
Wait a minute, did Google adopt your strategy? Is that the...
Larry, go pull it out. So that dynamic started to become the standard operating procedure there was go and look for the medium-sized groups and ensure that when you attack them, that you removed all members. You didn't just kind of cut off the head. The worst thing you can do is to remove leadership and then let the fragmentation of the population re-emerge back into the ecosystem.
And Joe, weren't you working in the
Pretty
field
closely,
on this?
yeah. I did a lot.
What were you doing in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Yeah, I was in. Matter of fact, did you know this? I got the SIGOX data declassified. It was with General Petraeus in Baghdad, and that created a lot of. I wrote a paper called "Can Hearts and Minds Be Bought?" with Jake Shapiro and other Burma. If you know
And
those
you probably
names.
were with Dave Kilcullen.
Yeah, very closely.
Yeah.
And
then-
didn't you set up the West Point counterinsurgency?
Yeah, have you heard of the West Point Combating Terrorism Center? We got like the Harming database,
Yes.
SIGOX database.
Yeah.
I started a nonprofit called Empirical Studies of Conflict. I don't know if you've heard of that. But,
We probably have a lot to talk about.
Right.
Yeah.
then I spent a couple years in Afghanistan running a coin advisory teams for.
So how long did you spend in doing this?
Oh, so I did my PhD from 2004 to 2008, and I think it was about 5.5 months in northern Iraq, which was more than enough time for me. So after that, I came back to Silicon Valley and decided that was enough war for a while.
And you started a company.
I did. I started. I met a guy named Peter Thiel, and he became an angel in my first company. It's a company called Quid. We wanted to do large-scale data visualization, and so that was kind of fun. But it was the first company, and we built that up and sold that.
So what were you thinking when you started the company? What was the vision?
I'd sort of come from this kind of ecosystem, if you can visualize a lot of data, you can kind of start to see patterns and structures inside of it, and that
Because of humans' ability to see things better than...
Yeah, it was kind of like, because the tools of AI were so sort of primitive, that no one was really able to kind of look at all that data and find patterns, but if you could visualize it, you could see structure inside of it. And so we just sort of said about how much data can you visualize, how many data points, how many different projections, how much connections. So with these beautiful sort of like interfaces of like connected networks of large data operating.
Like the original Palantir network.
Well, yeah, I mean, so I think there was kind of a lot of parallels between that stuff. I think our visualization was a lot better,
But their marketing might have been better.
well, they focused, and I think was rightly so. They focused on the national security problem.
And who were your customers?
So we had a whole range of customers, and the biggest users that were spending 10 million plus a year on it were McKinsey, BCG,
Really?
and some of the big consultancies. Yeah. They loved it because they could get strategic insights from this and then kind of feed it back to the customers at kind of 10 times the price. But the one, much to my chagrin, was the biggest users were the advertising companies, which there's sort of maybe a truism. Anytime you start a company, there's a good chance that the advertisers are going to become your main customers.
And why was that?
Publishers had a huge kind of contract. They'd use it to kind of look for kind of emerging narratives. And so you could kind of take vector embeddings of all the different kind of stories that were unfolding, and then map these stories and then see which kind of emerging trends were being owned by brands and which ones didn't have brands owning them. And so they loved it because they were like, oh, you know what, like no one's owning manliness. We can own manliness for this brand. And I kind of at that point, I was like, it's good that we're getting the revenue and stuff, but I'm probably done with this company.
Well, I could have run an election with that tool too, right?
So this is where it started to get really interesting, right? You start to get into this and you start saying, you know, all the different techniques you like, if you do want to start thinking about ideas transmitting and bouncing and manipulating, and even sort of circa 2013, 14, it was really clearly there. Now, we saw it all with kind of like, which I think is kind of like people overinflating what they did, but Cambridge Analytica.
There we go, that's where I was.
Their tech was, you know, nothing compared to, I think, what could have been done with a proper actor looking at the stuff.
And wait a minute, are proper actors now looking at the stuff?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, yeah. So
can we go down that rat hole for a second? Because what you're just explaining to me is computational physics, and this path actually ended up to be weaponized, not just for commercial use, but also for global use to shape narratives and elections and outcomes, et cetera. Can you take us down that? Sorry to.
Oh, no. It's exactly kind of where we sort of went through this. So maybe back up a step, right? There's a few kind of pieces that come in. The more times you're exposed to an idea, even if you disagree with the idea, the more likely you are to believe that idea. Which doesn't seem like it should hold, right? Because I don't believe it. But then you're like, the more times you see it, the more likely you are to believe it.
Goebbels and propaganda.
Even if you disagree with it. The second bit that's kind of true is that the more information that you believe to be untrue that's out there, the less likely you are to believe any information. So you've got two kind of dynamics. I can expose you to information and make you more likely to believe what I'm saying, which sort of option one. Option two is you believe that I'm trying to expose you to information, and therefore you disregard what I'm saying, but you also disregard what everyone else is saying. So if you're looking to corrupt a society based on free and fair debate and open ideas, you've got an asymmetric advantage, right? It's a lot more costly to defend against information attacks than it is to produce them, right? This is a massive asymmetry.
So you create TikTok and Facebook?
Well, so the first thing.
It's a joke, guys, or maybe not.
Well, yeah. Look, I think, put it another way, if you wanted, if you were an intelligence agency that wanted to put manipulation of the hearts and minds of an opponent, you would dream of having an application that served information to the 18 to 40-year-olds as a 90% dominant form where you could control with huge amounts of predictability their addiction to the platform, and you could amplify up or suppress down different narratives, not just on keywords, but on whether or not this thing was pro or anti any kind of a set of opinions you wanted. It's not hypothetical, of course, because you know, TikTok is the dominant platform. It is controlled still by a government that has large amounts of censorship capabilities. They do censor internally to their country. And whilst there is an explicit censorship, at least publicly, there is very, very clearly amplification and suppression of different kinds of narratives on that today that are measurable and obtainable. So if the US had something like that, we would consider it an amazing asset. And China, of course, does have that, and it is an amazing asset. Like, never before have you been able to kind of put your views and opinions into people's pockets and not really have them understand that you're controlling that.
And pay for it.
Yeah, and pay for it, and it's very profitable. It's like, it's like, you know, you've made a lot of money. So that's one side of it. The second side on that is these AIs that are created. I think my favorite sort of paper on this was, I think, maybe published the end of 23. It was in Science. Someone can probably fact check me on this, but it was looking at conspiracy theories, right? And so, some of you probably read this. It's conspiracy theories, those that hold conspiracy theories. The general statement is if you hold a conspiracy theory, don't bother arguing with someone because it'll just re-entrench their conspiracy theory, except if you're an AI. And so the AIs seem to be very, very effective at removing and changing kind of over long periods of time conspiracy theorists. So what that tells you is that that's good, but again, the inverse of that experiment is we're actually quite manipulable by these systems. And I think this kind of next layer of AI running in and changing beliefs I mean, it will be weaponized. And so who's going to do it?
So in your first startup, did you get into any of that, or was
yeah,
it just...
we got towards the end of it. Ash Carter was the new SecDef, a former Rhodes Scholar. And he came out to the Valley and he met with us. And I remember he was very clear. This is sort of the first push into the Valley with SecDef, Carter. And he signed a $1.5 million contract with us that day, which I was like, well, that's never sort of happened. That was into 2014.
What did he want you to do?
That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
He saw the sort of the power of the sort of the hearts and minds component of this, and was like, we need to, and I think he was in that sort of place where it was like, we need to start understanding. And look, if you look at the counterinsurgency dynamics in Iraq, I think there was, with the emergence of ISIS, I think seeing a very formidable opponent that was very, very good at winning hearts and minds. And so I think that was kind of front of mind for Carter as he was out here the first time in the Valley.
So that was your first startup?
That was my first startup,
boy,
yeah.
What a run. How many years was that?
God, it felt like forever. I think we
felt like forever?
Six years, I think it was, which is sort of true to my thing, is you can't do anything worth doing in less than 5 years. So it's like 6 tick.
And how long did you take in between that and...
A week. It was stupid.
Because?
I was like, I don't know, well, I think there was two things. So one is I'd got into disagreements with my co-founder around like the direction on the advertising. And he wanted to go more in the advertising, which is, look, maybe the right business kind of sense. So we got into disagreements on that, and I was
Never
like,
happens with co-founders.
Yeah, directions, it sort of happens.
Yeah.
And I think I was like, I'm going to show you, and I'm going to start my own company and build something better, and I'm going to make it for defense. And
okay, so full stop.
Yeah.
Knowing what you know now,
yeah.
What would you have done different as a co-founder in your first company?
I think when I started, as co-founders, you're like, I don't know, I'm the technical one, you're the CEO, business, like we'll split the roles. And it's all kind of the same for the first few years. And then it starts to become a real company, and all of a sudden the roles are quite different. And you're like, oh, the CEO is really different to the CTO. And it's not me. And so I think that's one. I don't think I would have given up I don't know the business side of it so well. I think coming out of a PhD, not having started a company and so on, I was like, I don't know, this business thing feels really difficult, like I don't really know about it. And I'm like, now looking back at it, I'm like, oh yeah, but you could have learned that.
Could have pre-computed this stuff
could have
in
learned
your
that
sleep.
stuff.
Yeah,
so I think that's one.
How many of you were engineering technical in the room? Yeah, take that to heart.
Right? It's a curve, right? Like, but it's something that's hard for 6 months, and then you've kind of got it. And I think for me, I was just like looking back at kind of the supposed business skills that I thought like were kind of high. I'm like, oh, that's not even close to kind of high. So I think you can learn. So that's number one. Is I think I would have. It's hard though, because you come in and you don't really know anything.
Could I or anybody would have been able to explain that to you when you were when you were the CTO, that hey, you could learn what the CEO knows, but it's going to be a long time before they could learn what you know. I mean, it's...
Yeah, I think having that mentor in your ear, I think would have gone a long way. Just someone to kind of be like, you got this.
Did you have mentors in your first company?
We'd meet
not board, but people. Your kitchen cabinet, you would call up at night.
We used to do breakfast at Peter's house.
Peter's too.
Yeah. But it wasn't. It was the most nervous kind of. I wouldn't say there was like a strong mentorship thing. I was like so scared going in there, kind of. But in hindsight, it was probably mentorship. I think I did learn a lot from those conversations. Max Levchin was on our board. Mm-hmm. But those relationships are kind of different. So I don't think I had someone who wasn't either an investor or a board member.
Are you mentor now to startups?
Yeah.
What is that relationship, a mentor relationship?
Most of the time, I just ask them how they're coping. You sort of get this kind of glazed kind of look of them, and you're like, how are you? Oh, the company's doing great. It's doing sort of, no. How are you? How are you? Are you sleeping? How's your relationship? Is it, are you if you've got kids, are you spending time with them? And just kind of like taking people down off of that, and just kind of being like, no one's going to look out for you. Everyone's got their own kind of hand in the game, and they want what they want from it, but literally no one, and it's kind of like world's smallest violin, but it's important. Like, but as a founder, like no one cares. Like no one cares, like, unless they care what you're doing, but they don't care about you. You're sort of and there are some examples of, like, I think there are some really, I will give a shout out to the guys at James Cham and Roy Bahart at Bloomberg Beta, who I think if you ever get a chance to take their money, they're wonderful, and they will. I think I've learned a lot from them about how I want, like, investors to interact with founders. But for the most part, no one's looking out for you, which means you've got to kind of be your own advocate. But I think when I spend time with founders now, it's funny, I can come into a lot of different places, but almost all the conversations after I ask that, the next hour, the next 3 hours I spend with them, is just like, oh yeah, like I've been kind of worried about this and thinking about that, and it's all very personal stuff. Like, so I think that's probably one piece of it is just that personal side, and I think it's a hard game to play, building startups. And people don't really give credit for how difficult it actually. I mean, no one's like, oh, this is an easy game, but I don't think people realize how much it physically hurts you. And it's not like physical. It's not like you're pulling muscles or stuff. But like, I think having kind of spent a bit of time looking at this stuff, I think the amount of cortisol you're processing, like, for a long period of time, without ever kind of coming off that trip, I think is really damaging. It wasn't until one of my friends, who was a CTO of one of the largest hedge funds in the world, he was like, Sean, we close our positions out on every Friday. There's no way I'd go over the weekend with a position open. He's like, I wouldn't get any rest. I was like, we close it out on Friday, take the week off, come back and play the game on Monday. And he's like, you're just letting this bet ride for 5 years? And you are, right? Like, ultimately, like, you're running this kind of bet where you're continually doubling down every time you're taking money on, and it's, at the same time, every sort of problem, everything that you're dealing with is kind of new to you. You haven't kind of maybe sort of seen it before. And so you run this kind of massive kind of cortisol kind of thing, and the prevailing wisdom is just kind of grind through it, right? Like, how much can you keep kind of running through it? And it reminds me, like, of the sort of the early sort of, like, time when I was training for decathlon. And,
right, you were a professional athlete.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about cortisol and exhaustion about a startup, you kind of knew what that was on the athlete side, and you're making it sound like this is equal or even harder physically.
Yeah, mentally it is. It's really hard. But I think it's because we don't give ourselves time to recover. All right, and so one of the interesting things about cortisol is it has these kind of decay phases. So if you give it 12 hours, it'll decay quite nicely. But that means you need to cut off, like, cortisol at about 7 p.m. and you need to, like, not let it hit again until, like, 7 a.m. So that means you need to, like, turn things off. The second one is there's like a 72-hour kind of window, which means Friday midday and Monday kind of morning, no cortisol. And then the third one that's really interesting is you get a cortisol decay that happens over about 6 weeks. Now, 6 weeks is really hard, right, in the startup world, to get 6 weeks away from sort of any kind of cortisol spikes.
That's called burnout.
Right, it's burnout, right, yeah. And so you go through this, and things that we call burnout is basically like never getting that recovery cycle. And what we know about the body is when you give it time to kind of like stress and then recover, it gets stronger. But if you give it stress and no recovery, it breaks. And the same is true physically as it is kind of mentally. And I think we're still in that sort of like, it's like the old gym bro culture, like just, no pain, no gain kind of. And you're like, no, the only reason you're lifting is so you can recover, right? Like if you just lift and don't recover, then you just like put yourself in a hole.
But not knowing this, you went from 6 years, took a week off and did your next one, right? Which is Primer.
Absolutely.
And so what was Primer?
Well, so Primer came in, was two things. I was flatting in the city with a good Australian friend of mine, a guy named Jeremy Howard. If you haven't done his fast AI courses, like, and you're looking for kind of an on-ramp to kind of any AI stuff, he's wonderful. They're all free and you can go and do that. I was living with him and he was super into kind of deep learning. And so we had a bunch of machines kind of processing images under the kitchen table. And I was like, I think there's something in this. This is 2014, kind of into 14. Wow. Because I remember I was like
just after ImageNet. Right?
I was giving it images of different things, and it was like recognized. It was like that's an aardvark, and I'm like, oh my god, that's like I don't know what an aardvark is. And so I was like, there's something in this. And so I was like, all right, number one, I was like, it's going to come for language. It's going to come for language. Like images, yeah, okay, tick. It's going to come for language. And then the second thing is, so I want to bet on AI for language, and I want to bet on the world's going to become more volatile. It's going to become, there's going to be more defense issues.
So the Venn diagram of your defense.
The Venn diagram of that. And the only kind of like downside on that is that I probably didn't bet big enough. I think in 2015, if you were making that kind of intersective bet between a sort of conditional probability on AI taking off for language and a more volatile geopolitical world, I think there's probably better ways to make money than starting a company. But we did all right with that. So that was a good bet. And so then we started that off. It was probably about 18 months too soon. I would like to have started post-transformer architecture, which would have been...
What was that, 2017?
2017. So about 18 months after we started, that paper came out. And we were primed. We saw it. We're like, oh, okay, this makes a big difference. But we came through and looked to kind of build information fusion for intelligence operations, both in the intelligence community and the defense community. So that was where we sort of started. We took a number of checks from In-Q-Tel. We ended up deploying 10 of the 16 US intelligence agencies. We were one of the foundation members of Project Maven, which was the first AI project that the Department of Defense did. We deployed, on the high side, the first large language models into classified data, which is interesting watching the conversation unfolding with Anthropic and Dario and all of that. And I was like, yeah, we've wrestled with that stuff, but we wrestled with that in 2018. Admittedly, we only had a 100 million parameter model when we first deployed inside of the agency, but that at the time was large.
And they were running on premises.
Running on-prem, air-gapped.
Because there was no AWS secure.
Yep, right? That's right. So we had to help the agencies up. They were like, does it run on a CPU? I was like, it's a strange question. I was like, oh, you don't have GPUs. Okay. But it was also too, it was like questions which were fascinating, which is like, if this has got this level of clearance and the AI infers something from something else, but doesn't take the data, but it infers it because it's seen something with a higher level of clearance, can that be shown down the chain or not? And then it was like, well, how is you're wrestling with hallucinations for the first time, like if people are seeing this, but you're also kind of like wrestling with just kind of, the bureaucracy of like, how do we change the entire workflows of operators and analysts inside of the organizations.
And you worked with General Shanahan when he was standing up the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center,
Jake,
right? And didn't they struggle with figuring out the use of AI and what the boundaries were and whatever? Were you involved in those conversations?
Yeah.
Which I found kind of funny because Anthropic was actually asking for the rules that were already in place, right?
So it's kind of without...
Everybody knew about the Anthropic controversy about the use of AI in warfare and whether you want to trust the machine or not, and should there be a human in the loop. The point I was making is that we already wrote those rules, and they were part of, and they are part of the DOW already there, and that those rules by this organization called the JAIC got embedded in something called CDAO now, which unless they deleted those rules, which I guess they could have, but keep going.
Yeah, so we actually wrestled with a lot of this stuff early on. The issue, I think, with the Anthropic piece of it, and I don't know, but if I was guessing, is they lost the social license to operate from their employees. And the employees kind of drew a line and said, this is the line that we don't want to go beyond. And one of the hard bits on that is, and it's changed a lot now, but certainly in 2017, this is the time when Google literally had people walking out the door because Google was involved with Project Maven initially, and then their employees threatened to walk out the door. And then Google backed out of it. And so the hardest part was actually bringing your employees along on that journey and being 2017, which was, a difficult time, but saying we're gonna deploy AI and it's gonna be put in the hands of warfighters, intelligence analysts, Department of Homeland Security, and we're gonna have to trust those institutions to make use of it, right? But you do have to make that sort of trade. It's you don't get to give the Department of War technology and say, but I want veto on how it's used. It's just when the people have the missiles and the guns, they say, no, we tell you how it's used. You can choose not to get into bed with us, but the moment you're into bed with us, it's ours. And I think one of the things on that is you've got to have your employees kind of come with you on that journey very, very closely. But the second bit is you need to be sort of, perhaps not naive, but you have to realize that it's not your game to write all the rules on at the moment you step into that arena. Yeah.
Interesting. And so just for the class, how embedded is AI in the Department of Defense / War today?
I would say it's barely scratched the surface.
Really?
Right. I would say it's I do think the new administration has been very, I think Hesketh has been very clear that this is something he wants inside of the organization. I think that being said, it's kind of what you get when any large organizations is we need to do AI, and it's like, all right, okay, well, go and get the bots, right? Like I'm chatting with the things. Right. And it's like,
all
right.
A 10-pound bag or a 5-pound bag?
So I think that side of it is.
So the top gets it, or at least gets the word.
I think I would say they get the importance of it.
I mean, they just made Maven a program of record, right?
They get the importance, if not the mechanics. Right. So I'd say where that is. I'd say the second bit that you've got is you've got a much bigger willingness to work with emerging companies, and so. We were, would have been 2019? So we were sitting in Pentagon. There was us, Anduril, there was two other companies, and then the 3-star at the time. He's like, I'm going to be honest. Like we'd like to say you were the best, companies to come in here, but you were the only ones that we thought were going to answer our call to build kind of kill chain applications for the Air Force. And that gives you a bit of a sense of just kind of where the sort of reluctance in that time was to engage in the defense process. So that's changed a lot. There's, I think, a much bigger appetite for people to get involved in this problem space, but there's also a much kind of easier on-ramp inside of these organizations to bring startups into these environments. So that's changed a lot. And as a result of that, the offerings by default that new companies are building have got this kind of capabilities built inside of them. Then the third bit has obviously been, I think everyone's seen kind of very clearly the lessons of autonomy coming out now. Iran, very limited, but if the conflict kind of rolls on, we're going to see a lot more of that. But there's certainly autonomy inside of Ukraine theater.
What are you seeing there in autonomy?
So probably, well, the first bit is like pure, so just to separate autonomy of like I've got a first-person vision flying a drone versus the drone flies itself. The real sort of autonomy that's happening there is maybe the final mile, which is like if I lose comms with the drone, it can probably do some basic image recognition and find the kind of the target. Secondly, I can probably fly a dozen drones as one commander and not necessarily have to fly all of them. And of course the PIDs, if you're kind of like got the flight controllers, right? Like, obviously all the drones have, flight controls so that the latency, I don't need to adjust to a turbulent kind of gust, like it'll sort of fly itself. So there's what I'd call like, I don't know, maybe it's like level 2 in the self-driving car kind of dynamic. Maybe it's level 3. That's probably where autonomy is in Ukraine. But like Ukraine's also just kind of really being like, how do I deliver more drones with these capabilities cheaper rather than how do I make them better? I think if you were planning for a conflict in sort of 2-3 years and you were kind of the US or you were China, you would like look to kind of like bake in a lot more autonomy into that. And so autonomy is possible. I think Ukraine has shown how effective those capabilities are, but you need a 2 to 3 year kind of runway to build it in.
And are you also seeing it in analysts first, or?
Yeah, so that's been the bigger kind of thing. So like the willingness to adopt
and targeteers, right?
So back in 2017, when we first did our deployments with the agencies, like they were the analysts, right? And they were a lot more comfortable.
What's an analyst?
Like an analyst, so if you're an intelligence agency, we're not saying who we worked with, but let's say the CIA is an intelligence agency.
In theory.
In theory. They'll have operators, which are kind of your Jason Bournes, and then you have your analysts, which are the people that sort of sit on the Iran desk and kind of go, am I going to put the fact that the strait is very closable into this presidential daily briefing or not, right? So, their job is to kind of analyze. So they'll have many analysts, I think. You can probably look up some numbers, but it's certainly tens of thousands of analysts to sit down and analyze situations. And to do that, they've got a whole bunch of documents. So these are their classified documents that they run, and this is produced by all the different stations around the world. And they'll be like, I was tracking this person and they seem to meet with that. This person is known for dealing kind of guns, and I've noted it and sent off the cable. So they can be kind of like that, or they can be like, here's my in-depth analysis of the protest movement in Tehran and its likelihood of actually being able to overthrow the government. So you can range all across that
And they
spectrum.
might also have tip-offs from other agencies with good
Yeah, and then you've got space, I've analysed the space data from the NRO, and that's, so all of that sort of feeds in, and you create this huge kind of document set of all the different observations, the things happening. And inside of that, as an analyst, your job is to try and make sense of all that and figure out an answer to a question, which is like, will there be a popular uprising in Tehran if we remove the administration? And so there'll be a bunch of analysts working on that, and their job is to kind of come up with analysis and models. But if you think about what they were doing with that, right, it's all disconnected from the internet. It's running, on very primitive, like circa 2015. It's running on very primitive kind of like search and kind of information retrieval systems. And then you're going through that and bringing AI into that system. And so that sort of journey from what effectively is, if you're an information retriever, like a BM25 is basically, the kind of like the standard kind of information retrieval algorithm, like running that through to an AI kind of system today. And so that's been a much easier kind of journey, and I think you've seen much more stronger adoption of AI by the analysts. It's harder to get the adoption into the kinetic side of it, not because it's a harder problem, but because I think the sort of the existing manufacturers that are producing things have got systems that don't integrate well with all the AI. Yeah. And then the second bit is, and I think like the jury's still out on this, but I think it'll change, is there was firstly a reluctance to automate anything inside of the kill chain, and then secondly,
kill chain is exactly what it sounds like.
Exactly like, yeah, I've got data, I've got a target, I've got a kinetic, I've got a destroy, right? Like
kinetic is something that goes boom.
Yeah, something that goes boom, yeah. And so automating that or all of that, and so it started off we won't automate it, then it was like we'll automate, but a human has to have the final decision. Now it's like a human has to be involved in that loop, have to be on the chain but not in the chain. And now there are some situations it's fine for the human to be out of that chain, or the chain can be really upstream of that chain. So you can sort of see the direction where this is going.
But it's going to happen.
Yeah, like, I mean, the bit that people have missed on this is in the 1940s and the Second World War, there were automatic anti-aircraft guns that were coordinated by radar, yeah. And there was no human involved. If it saw something coming in, it directed its fire and shot down the plane. Like, yeah.
So let's go back to analysts for a second. So prediction markets are actually analysts with AI outside of the intelligence agency,
making bets from DC pubs on what they've just figured out.
Yes, right? Isn't that kind of a bizarre off-take of this?
Yeah, I mean, so that's right. So
and there's now geopolitical prediction markets as well, like Vinsco, who was the ex-CTO of NGH, started a company.
Yeah, I mean, so has anyone placed bets on Clashy or Polymarket?
No, raise your hand. Right.
Yeah, a financial market is a price discovery mechanism that is supposed to kind of rely on the wisdom of crowds, except when it goes wrong, when everyone starts behaving in a herd dynamics, everyone believes this because they've got the same information and the same strategy. The strategy could be if it goes up, it's going to keep going up, right? Momentum trading, or if it's going to go down, it's going to keep going down. So you've got to have a plethora of strategies, and you've got to have a range of different information streams. So that's when markets move well. The interesting thing about these markets is, do they have those components? And in that sense, the inside information is a feature, not a bug, because it's different information and different strategies. If they do work well, it starts to kind of hold up a bit of a light against, you certainly see that becoming a topic of conversation in DC at the moment. Like, people will be very familiar with the prediction markets.
It's the ultimate OSINT.
Well, everyone's like, the probability of Taiwan being invaded by China at the end of this year is 17%. Like, that'll be a known number amongst all of the.
But I want to see the bets that are coming in from Beijing on that.
Well,
market.
Yeah, I mean, so this is kind of like some interesting kind of hedge kind of dynamics that you could bring in.
So before we run out of time, I want to talk, if you want to, about, okay, you left Primer.
Yep.
right? And then for a short period of time, you were one of the most prolific angel investors on some, you should look at the stuff he's invested in. Look at his LinkedIn. It's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's not even all of it,
Yeah, but then you got back in the game just now.
Yeah,
so did you have those 6 weeks? Did you take those 6
weeks? I've taken 2 years.
Perfect.
I made a sort of a thing that I wouldn't do anything for 18 months. And 18 months became 2 years, and I was like,
good for you.
You know, I'm sort of ready. And, you know, what I got a chance to do was go and like, sort of either invest or advise, but mostly sort of like spend time with companies that I thought were just kind of doing things that I thought were cool and I didn't really understand.
Do you think it made you a better startup CEO?
I think it's allowed me to be more detached from it all. Like, I think I was way too, and I think a lot of found, I don't know if it's just me, but I think I was way too attached to your company. It just becomes your identity. It's like, I'm Sean, the CEO and founder of, like, you know, like, yeah, no, it's just like, it's a thing. Like, you know, you could have invested in it. Like, it's like the angels are like, I invested in this thing and helped build it. It's like, yeah, you put some money in, man. Like, I don't know. But I think that actually, like, is actually really healthy, is taking that step back. And it's just
so
like,
that was 2 years of taking.
Yeah, so sitting on boards, like becoming an advisor, an investor, you sleep really well. Like, because you just like, it's someone else's problem. It's someone else's problem. Right? And so I think that's really healthy to take that into like startups, where it's like at the end of the day, it's like I don't know, like someone's going to give you some money to build a company. It doesn't have to be your life.
So what did you see that got you back in the game?
I saw that the world wasn't going to get any more peaceful, and that like I whilst I could kind of sit and kind of enjoy the sort of the spoils of you know, success, like it would kind of be a dumb thing to sit on the sideline and be in a place where we're literally battling for kind of the next kind of geopolitical empire, which I do believe like we're into that sort of space where the great powers are at conflict, and who wins is going to have a really meaningful impact on the world that we're going to live in and that our kids are going to live in, right? Like, depending which side this goes. And I was like, if that happens and someone's like, well, what did you do? I was like, I don't know, I was enjoying surfing in Bali. It was pretty cool. And I guess they won. I mean, and you're like, that's not right. So I was like, all right, I can't like, in all honesty, enjoy this knowing that this is going on. So I was like, all right, I probably have to get back in and do something. So I was like, well, what can I do that I think is important, that I think is interesting, that can put me with kind of some of the smartest people, which is where I like to work, and can kind of be at the edge of kind of what's possible. So that was kind of that space. And I think that was the piece. So what I came up with in that, I'd seen like a lot of the early days, we were in language and AI very early, but everyone else was doing reinforcement learning and computer games. And then they all kind of went across to language models. And I was like, I think we've left something there. I think there's a thrust of research and reinforcement learning that's super interesting that hasn't been fully mined. And I think playing computer games with different AI systems is super interesting. Second bit is we've got on order of 20 million drones for warfare that are going to be produced in the next 24 months.
Wow.
Like that's happening. We're seeing the effectiveness of them. There are going to be 20 million you know, drones and growing. And we're going to have to be able to control, navigate, move them. And so it's like this intersection of playing really advanced computer games with AI and controlling hundreds of thousands of drones in battle or ground vehicles or whatever is a really interesting sort of AI problem. Not flying a drone, but coordinating a swarm of them. And how do you do this? You can't just use reinforcement learning where you brute force a solution to optimize a kind of a game like StarCraft. You actually have to build a robust solution to kind of make that work. So this kind of intersection of how do you create robust solutions to complex strategic real-time games, and then put that onto kind of hardware that can kind of operate in contested environments and make that work with the right level of human oversight on top of it. And so that's kind of the new company.
Wow.
We're 3 months old. We've put about 20 million into kind of what's kind of called a pre-seed at this point. I don't know how that works. But it's kind of, it's the new term. But it's enough to kind of get the team started. We've got 5 or 6 of us running, and so, you know, most of my days at the moment are trying to negotiate flight flight regulations for like beyond visual line of sight swarms, and that's kind of harder than you think to kind of have like swarms of kind of killer robots flying over the US, but we're working on it. And then the other side is, at the moment we've got a challenge to kind of get to kind of level 8, if any StarCraft fans here, but level 8 with less than $20,000 of compute, which when AlphaStar DeepMind solved it, it was $30 million. So we're sort of trying to do that, and then take that game and then have that system which we've trained be able to kind of play real-time games involving the drones.
Should have named the company Ender's Game.
Well, Ender's Game is a big part of this. So the last company for me,
we should all read it if you haven't.
Last company
we're living it.
Was called Primer, and I'd read Neil Stephenson's Diamond Age, if you'd read that. And
so we're going to run out of time, and I know Ernestine is going to. But one last question for you to the students here: how can they contribute to national security and do something that matches their passion and mission and interest?
Yeah, I think the best thing you can do, there's 2 pathways you can take. One is, I think you can, we'll call it 3 pathways. You can obviously go and start a company, right? And take that level of detachment from it. Like, it's a free run, it's a free shot, it doesn't have to be your entirety. Go and have some fun. Go and build a company. You'll probably fail, but go and have a good journey, right? And you'll learn a lot of stuff. You can go and join another company that's already doing the work. And I think coming out of university, if you're sort of unsure on that stuff, like going and working with another bunch of people that are running fast and trying to like solve a really difficult problem that are incredibly smart is just a great place to be. And the third thing is you can go into the institutions that are actually kind of doing this stuff. And a big believer that the United States, what makes it great is the institutions, and the institutions exist because of great people going into them, right? And so I think that dynamic there is like the 3 ways you can kind of come into this, and I think you can hopefully come to a bit of reflection of things like, if the world is moving this way, and it is, what do you want to have done and why?
Thanks.
And I think the time of the long peace that we've grown up with is over, and the world is very different today.
Wow, great advice. Thank you, Sean.
But yeah, so when you were at Oxford, I was at West Point teaching and running a combating terrorism center there, and we got a couple academy grads here. But at lunch they have, they have, say, attention orders. They give out announcements, and sadly at that time, this was the height of the Iraq War and Afghanistan started. There'd be a recent graduate. They'd announced their death in combat, and so it was really real. And we realized we didn't know Sun Tzu. Our class was, you have to know the nature of the war you're in, right? And we didn't even know the kind of fight we're in. And it was, here we are, a superpower losing against a bunch of ragtag insurgents, in Iraq and then later Afghanistan. Then data analytics and data collection gave us the opportunity to change that game. But even then, and you probably experienced this, there were these, people that were just that I understand it because of my experience in one case, and they weren't going to take some, you were pretty young at the time, saying, here's what the data shows, but you probably met some resistance because some of these knuckle dragger professionals said, no, I know better, and I lived that a bit too. And we tried to develop a counterinsurgency manual on the fly. I worked with that. That's where I think I worked with David Cutton a little bit. But anyways, you can have a gut feeling, but you need more. Well, in addition to data and analytics, you need committed people, and I'm sure I'm going to include you in this, that are willing to evangelize us, to take those findings and actually try to help us understand, what's more important than reducing conflict and reducing the cost of those conflicts on the battlefield. So I just think it's incredibly important. If you know me and taking some of my classes or Steve's classes, we started a program here called Hacking for Defense a while ago, along with Army Colonel Pete Newell, and then we started this center at Gourley Center. I'm kind of motivated by this thing, and you hit right on this. You can do good and do well. Care about the impact you're having, and I think what you did with your early startup and continue to do is a great example of that. And also you mentioned we need good people in these institutions, so get after that. But so all of you aspiring startup founders, think about the impact you're having. You can do good and do well, and Sean, I think you've done that